addiction, the brain, and the person. Why doesn't neurobiology explain everything? When studying the capital vices, it is inevitable to arrive at a question: why is it so difficult to change? Often, a person intellectually understands that a certain attitude is harmful to them. They realize that a certain reaction is disordered, recognizing pride, envy, anger, or another vice in their way of acting. And yet, when faced with a certain situation, they react almost automatically in the same way. It is as if understanding were on one side and an ancient force were on the other. Neurobiology can help us extraordinarily to understand a part of this phenomenon. However, it is necessary to establish a fundamental principle from the beginning. Explaining the brain's participation in a behavior is not the same as fully explaining the person who performs that behavior. This caution is necessary because there's currently a tendency to turn any neurobiological discovery into a total explanation of the human being. A brain region involved in an emotion is discovered, and immediately it is said that that emotion is that region. A certain neural activity is observed during a choice, and it is concluded that it was the brain that decided. An alteration associated with a certain behavior is found, and people start talking as if the person could be reduced to the functioning of their neurons. Psychoanalysis of affective formation should not move in this direction. The brain participates deeply in our psychological life. Our history modifies the brain. Learning modifies the brain. Trauma can modify the brain. Habits modify the brain. Effective psychotherapy can produce brain changes. However, none of this means that human experience can be reduced to the brain. It means precisely the opposite. Since we are bodily beings, what we experience also leaves a history in our bodies. It is at this point that the work of neuroscientist Eric Kandel becomes particularly interesting. Kandel received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2000 for his discoveries related to the molecular mechanisms of signal transmission in the nervous system, and particularly for his studies on the cellular mechanisms of learning and memory. For decades, he studied relatively simple forms of learning, using among other experimental models, aplysia, a sea slug whose nervous system allows for observing with great precision the changes that occur between neurons during learning. These studies demonstrated something of enormous importance. Learning does not simply mean adding abstract information to some mental repository. Learning modifies the way in which certain neurons communicate. In long-lasting forms of learning, persistent modifications can occur in the strength of synaptic connections, protein synthesis, and structural changes related to the connections between neurons. That is where we can carefully draw a contribution to understanding habits. When we popularly say that a certain repetition has created a path in the brain, we are using a metaphor. We should not literally imagine a cerebral road through which an impulse will inevitably have to pass. A more accurate formulation would be to say that repeated experience can strengthen certain patterns of functioning and make certain responses progressively more available, efficient, or automatic. This helps us understand why a repeated response often starts to happen before any long conscious deliberation. In the beginning, a certain reaction might have required several thoughts. After hundreds or thousands of repetitions, a similar situation is enough for the set of thoughts, feelings, and action tendencies to be activated again with great speed. This is where neurobiology begins to engage with psychology. Let's suppose, for example, a person deeply dependent on the approval of others. Someone criticizes them. That criticism doesn't just arise psychologically as information, it is interpreted as a threat. They are diminishing my value. Immediately, an effective reaction may appear: shame, fear, irritation, or anger. Next, a defense arises. I need to show that I am right. The person argues, justifies themselves, attacks, disqualifies the one who criticized them, or tries to control the situation. When they manage to restore their image and feel relief, that entire sequence ends up being reinforced once again. Threat, defense, response, relief. Repeat this dynamic for years, and we'll have an increasingly familiar response. It is important, however, to understand one thing. Neurobiology can investigate how this learning takes place in the body, but it cannot, on its own, explain the meaning of that reaction. A brain scan could eventually show which networks are being recruited at that moment, but the scan would not tell us by itself, this man is trying to protect an idealized image of himself because he learned to relate his personal value to approval. This is a psychological formulation. Much less could it conclude that which is being protected constitutes a disordered love of self. This is already a moral and anthropological analysis. These are distinct levels of knowledge about the same man. Confusing them produces reductionism. Neurobiology asks, among other things, what bodily mechanisms participate in this learning? Psychology asks, what does this situation mean for the person? What effects appear? What defenses are used? What patterns repeat themselves? Moral analysis asks, toward what good is the person oriented? Is their love ordered? Does their will seek a true good or an apparent good? And philosophical anthropology asks, what is this person who thinks, desires, feels, chooses, and acts? None of these questions needs to destroy the others. On the contrary, a truly human understanding requires that we know how to distinguish them in order to later integrate them. This concern with integration also appears in Candle's own intellectual trajectory. In 1998, when proposing a new conceptual framework for psychiatry, he advocated for an approach between biology and psychological understanding. In his model, social factors and learning experiences are not rivals to biological factors. Social experiences can produce lasting modifications in brain functioning. He even proposed that when psychotherapy produces stable changes in behavior, these changes likely involve learning processes capable of modifying synaptic connections. The following year, Candle went even more directly towards psychoanalysis. In Biology and the Future of Psychoanalysis, he argued that psychoanalysis could benefit from a systematic dialogue with biology and cognitive neuroscience, including research on memory, unconscious processes, and learning. This is very different from saying that neuroscience replaces psychology. Candle wished to build a bridge. A bridge has two banks. If we eliminate one of them, there is no longer a bridge. The discovery that a psychological experience has cerebral consequences does not make the psychological experience illusory. When someone learns a language, their brain also changes. That doesn't make grammar a branch of neurology. When a person learns music, there are changes in the brain. That doesn't mean music can be reduced to neuronal firings. In the same way, if humiliation profoundly changes a person and leaves neurobiological consequences, it does not mean that humiliation is merely a neuronal alteration. It remains a human, interpersonal event endowed with meaning. This principle is decisive for understanding defense mechanisms. A psychological defense should not be imagined as a small part located in a specific brain region. It would also be reckless to say, we have found the neural circuit of rationalization, or this is the neuron of pride. It doesn't work like that. When someone repeatedly uses certain forms of defense in the face of similar threats, these responses can become increasingly habitual. Brain functioning necessarily participates in this learning, but the defense is understood psychologically by the function it performs in the person's organization. For example, when I feel inferior, I need to attack. When I feel that I might be rejected, I pull away before the other person can reject me. When I make a mistake, I immediately look for a justification. When something hurts the image I have of myself, I try to blame someone else. At a certain point, these responses can become so fast that the subject barely notices the path taken. That is when a very common subjective experience arises. I knew what I should do, but something inside me reacted. Or it seems like there is a part of me that acts before I do. It is not necessary to imagine a second person inhabiting the individual. What exists may be a learned organization of affects, expectations, interpretations, and defenses that has become highly automated. This distinction is especially important for understanding the ego and FAP. The ego should not be turned into the root of moral evil, as if there were a perverse entity inside the person that needed to be destroyed. The ego performs necessary psychological functions and can be more or less ordered. The problem appears when its functioning begins to defensively serve disordered affections and loves. In this case, the ego is not necessarily the origin of the vice. It can become its defender. A proud person, for example, might not consciously think, I am proud and I want to protect my pride. Most likely, they will think, they are being unfair to me, I need to explain. The person didn't understand. If I stay quiet, they will think I am wrong. The defense provides arguments. This explains why vices rarely appear to us, clearly announcing their identity. Envy doesn't usually say, I am envy. It might say, he doesn't deserve that. Pride doesn't usually say, I want to be superior. It might say, I'm just defending the truth. Disordered anger doesn't necessarily say, I wish to hurt. It might say, someone needs to put this person in their place. That is why self-knowledge is so difficult. Vice uses thoughts that have the appearance of rationality. It is at this point that the Thomistic conception habit becomes extremely fruitful. St. Thomas understands virtue as a habitual disposition that orders a person's faculties to act well. Correspondingly, he also treats vices as bad dispositions acquired or strengthened by the repetition of acts. We have, therefore, a fascinating possibility for dialogue. St. Thomas is speaking to habitus on a moral and anthropological level. Gundel is investigating cellular mechanisms of learning and memory. They're not the same thing. The Thomistic habitus cannot be reduced to a synapse. Virtue is not a good neural circuit, and vice is not a bad neural circuit. However, it is perfectly reasonable to expect that a corporeal human being, upon acquiring relatively stable ways of acting, also exhibits learning processes and plasticity in the nervous system. This distinction protects both science and philosophy. If we say that Thomas Aquinas had already discovered neuroplasticity, we would be committing an anachronism. If we say that neuroplasticity has made the concept of virtue unnecessary, we would be committing a reductionism. Each one is describing a different level, and that is precisely why they can engage in dialogue. In the reading we are developing for the PFA, there is still a deeper level. For St. Thomas, self-love is not evil in itself. Loving oneself correctly is something due. The problem arises when this love loses its order, and the person begins to seek for themselves goods in a way contrary to reason and to the true good. When discussing the origin of sin, Thomas deals precisely with self-love as a principle when it becomes disordered. We can then imagine the following sequence: disordered self-love leading to the pursuit of an apparent good, to disordered acts, to repetition, to the formation and strengthening of vice, to increasingly stable affective and defensive responses, to learning and memory, to greater automation of the response. Notice the importance of order. We don't start with the brain, we start with the person who loves, desires, interprets, chooses, and acts. The brain participates in this person's story. The brain learns from what the person repeatedly lives and does, but it is not the brain that determines what constitutes the supreme good, what deserves to be loved, whether an action was just, whether an intention was upright, or whether a defense is being used to escape the truth. These questions belong to other levels of human reality. It is here that St. Thomas's anthropology offers an especially valuable protection against two opposing errors. The first error would be a crude dualism, imagining soul and body as two independent things, almost as if the true person were imprisoned inside an unimportant biological machine. St. Thomas does not think this way. For him, the soul is the form of the body. Man is a unity. The concrete human being is not simply a soul temporarily using a body, which is why what happens bodily matters enormously. Sleep, illness, substances, brain injuries, development, learning, and countless other bodily conditions can profoundly influence our psychological life. But the opposite error must also be avoided. From the body-soul unity, it does not follow that the person is merely cerebral matter. Within Thomistic anthropology, intelligence is not simply an operation of a specific bodily organ, although man, while united to the body, depends on sensitive powers and bodily conditions for many of the operations involved in knowledge. Therefore, PFA does not need to choose between everything is psychological and everything is cerebral. Both are simplifications. We are a unity, and this profoundly changes the way of understanding healing. If a certain vice has been accompanied for years by psychological responses and repeated bodily learnings, we can't imagine that the simple intellectual discovery of its origin will immediately erase everything that has been formed. A person might say today, "Now I understand my pride." Excellent, but for 30 years, they may have responded to criticism by defending themselves. The understanding happened today, the habit is 30 years old. That is why something seemingly contradictory happens. The person knows the truth and continues to feel the old impulse. They then conclude, if I understood it, why do I keep feeling this? Because understanding and acquiring a new habit are not the same thing. The intelligence can recognize a truth in a few minutes. The affections need to be educated, the will needs to be exercised, defenses need to become conscious, and new responses need to be practiced. And since man is a bodily unit, this new learning will also find expression in the plasticity of the nervous system. This is where consciousness acquires decisive importance. Without consciousness, the process can happen like this: threat, defense, reaction. The person is criticized and immediately justifies themselves. They feel rejected and immediately withdraw. They feel inferior and immediately attack. They feel envy and immediately disqualify. But consciousness introduces an interval: threat, automatic tendency toward perception of the tendency, toward I am feeling the need to defend myself, toward judgment of reason, toward choice, action. This small interval changes everything. The old reaction continues to exist, but it ceases to have absolute dominion over the action. It is exactly here that the person begins to distinguish I feel this from I am this, or there's a tendency in me to act this way from I need to act this way. This inner distance does not destroy the effects, it places them back under the observation of reason. It is in this sense that consciousness in PFA does not just mean possessing information about oneself. It means achieving a humble lucidity regarding one's own functioning, being able to perceive thoughts, feelings, impulses, and defenses without immediately identifying with them. The person begins to observe the inner movement before obeying it. Then the possibility of a contrary response arises. The proud person notices the impulse to justify themselves and remains silent. The envious person notices the tendency to diminish the good in others and deliberately acknowledges that good. The angry person notices the desire to attack and chooses to respond with firmness, without hurting. The lazy person notices the urge to escape and begins what they should be doing. The vain person notices the need to show off and does good without seeking recognition. An isolated response does not yet constitute a perfect virtue, but something essential has happened. The old path was not followed. If this is repeated, a new ease begins to emerge. The same plasticity that participates in the consolidation of disordered responses also allows for new learning. That is why neuroplasticity should not be presented only as an explanation of how we get trapped in vices. It also helps to biologically understand why we are not condemned to them. But again, we need to avoid reductionism. It is not the brain that decides to become virtuous. It is the person who, recognizing a good, seeks to choose it repeatedly. The brain bodily accompanies this learning. Virtue remains virtue because there's a person directing their powers toward the good, and not because a certain brain scan started to show a pattern considered desirable. Brain is not morally humble. A person is humble. A neuron's not envious. A person can be envious. A synapse does not practice justice. A person practices justice. We can find the biological correlates of all these acts, but the correlate should not be confused with the totality of what's being explained. This distinction can perhaps be summarized by a simple image. Imagine a man playing a piece on the piano. We can analyze the muscles of his hands, we can measure the nerve impulses, we can observe the activity of his cerebral cortex, we can investigate his motor memory. All of this is true, but none of these descriptions alone will tell us why that piece of music was composed, what it means, why he decided to play it at his father's funeral, or why a certain passage makes him cry. Neurobiology describes a real dimension of the event. It does not describe the event in its entirety. The same is true for man in the face of his vices. There is the brain, there is memory, there is learning, there is the body, there are affects, there are defense mechanisms, there are thoughts, there is personal history, there are relationships, there is intelligence, there is will, there are choices, there are habits, there are vices and virtues. And from the spiritual perspective assumed by the PFA, there is also the ultimate orientation of human love, that which man takes as his good and around which he organizes his other loves. No neuroimaging can show the correct order of loves. It can show a man's brain while he loves. It cannot determine for him what deserves to be loved above all things. It is precisely for this reason that the contribution of neurobiology is so valuable when it remains in its proper place. It helps us understand why our history has bodily weight. It helps us understand why certain responses become quick and resistant. It helps us realize that memories and learning leave real consequences on the organism. It helps us understand why change requires repetition, and it also helps us abandon a naive view that simply understanding the problem would be enough for decades of psychological functioning to disappear. But neurobiology does not replace psychology. Psychology does not replace moral philosophy, and none of them within the structure of PFA should claim to replace theology. The correct contribution is not reduction, it is integration. We can, therefore, formulate the process of vices in this way. Disordered love guides, vice disposes, defense protects, repetition strengthens, learning consolidates, the brain participates in this consolidation, and automation makes the response progressively easier. In the same way, the opposite movement can be formulated like this. Truth illuminates, conscience perceives, reason judges, the will chooses, the person practices, repetition educates, learning consolidates, and virtue makes doing good progressively easier. This is perhaps one of the most important conclusions of this study of the capital vices. The fact that a response is deeply inscribed in our learning doesn't mean that it constitutes our identity. A person is not their vice, nor are they their defense mechanism, and they are certainly not simply the activation pattern of their brain. There is within them a learned history that can exert enormous influence over thought, feeling, and action. But there is also the possibility of consciousness, judgment, choice, and the formation of new habits. It is precisely for this reason that the fight against vices can be so difficult. We are not just dealing with wrong ideas that need to be replaced by correct ideas. We are often dealing with a way of feeling, interpreting, defending oneself, and acting that has been practiced for years, and which, precisely because it has been practiced, has become familiar. Virtue requires something deeper than information, it requires formation. And formation means that the truth known by the intelligence must progressively descend into concrete life, reach the affections, guide the will, and transform itself into repeated action until what was once only known also becomes lived. That is where the truth begins to become a habit, and that is where the person, instead of simply fighting against what has become automatic within them, begins to slowly form a new way of being and acting.